I recently came across a quote from Viola Davis that stopped me in my tracks. She said, "The definition of hell is that on your last day on earth, the person you became meets the person you could have become." I think the reason this quote affects people so deeply is because it touches something many people rarely speak about openly. The fear that somewhere along the way they became disconnected from themselves. Not simply from ambition or potential, but from something more essential: their deeper nature, their emotional truth, their unlived life. Many people assume psychological suffering arrives dramatically. They imagine crisis, breakdown, or obvious distress. In reality, it often arrives much more quietly. It can show up as emotional flatness, chronic overthinking, a persistent sense of internal distance, or simply the feeling that life is functioning externally while something internally remains unresolved. Interestingly, I see this even among people who appear highly successful from the outside. One of the reasons this happens is because human beings are remarkably adaptive. From early childhood onwards, we learn how to become acceptable to the environments around us. We learn which emotions receive approval, which parts of ourselves are rewarded, which vulnerabilities feel unsafe, and which identities create belonging, as well as which ambitions appear respectable. Over time, adaptation becomes automatic. And while adaptation is often necessary, it can come at a cost. Many people become extraordinarily competent versions of themselves while simultaneously becoming distant from who they actually are beneath the adaptation. This creates a subtle but profound psychological tension. A person can appear capable, successful, and functional while privately feeling disconnected, exhausted, or strangely unreal. Not because they are failing, because maintaining an externally constructed identity requires continual psychological effort. This is one reason why so many people experience a form of emptiness that achievement alone cannot resolve. Existential psychology has explored this dilemma for decades. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard described despair not simply as sadness, but as a failure to become oneself fully. Martin Heidegger wrote about how people disappear into what he called the they, the socially conditioned version of existence shaped by expectation, conformity, and unconscious imitation. In both cases, the concern is not merely emotional suffering, it is a disconnection from authentic selfhood. And this is what makes Viola Davis's quote so psychologically powerful. Because most people already sense, somewhere beneath the surface, that another version of themselves exists. Not a perfect version, not a fantasy self built around achievement or status, but a more integrated one. A version with greater honesty, greater emotional clarity, greater congruence, greater freedom from performance. A version where inner and outer life are more closely aligned. The pain comes from recognizing the distance between these two selves. Many people encounter this feeling unexpectedly, perhaps when meeting old friends, perhaps when revisiting places that once mattered deeply, or remembering earlier periods of life in which they felt more alive, more connected, or more themselves. What often emerges in those moments is not simply nostalgia, it is an awareness of how much has changed, and sometimes an awareness of how much of ourselves may have been left behind. And this is where things become particularly interesting, because external success does not necessarily solve the problem. In some cases, it intensifies it. People operating high levels professionally often become extremely skilled at functioning under pressure while neglecting the emotional and psychological structures underneath that functioning. The result can be a strange contradiction. A life that appears successful externally while feeling emotionally unfinished internally. This is rarely discussed openly because the individual may have little visible reason to complain. They may have achievement, stability, influence, responsibility, admiration. Yet internally, they may feel increasingly distant from meaning, spontaneity, emotional presence, or themselves. This is not weakness, nor is it ingratitude. It is often the consequence of prolonged adaptation without sufficient self-reflection. Modern culture amplifies this problem considerably. Digital environments reward visibility over reflection. Productivity culture rewards output over meaning. Social media rewards performance over authenticity. Artificial intelligence increasingly rewards speed and optimization over depth. Many people now spend more time managing how they appear than understanding who they are. Tension becomes fragmented, stillness becomes uncomfortable, depth becomes inefficient. Over time, this can produce a subtle form of internal erosion. The individual remains active, productive, and externally engaged, yet increasingly disconnected from emotional grounding and psychological coherence. This is why so many people eventually begin searching for something beyond surface level self-improvement. Not simply motivation, but orientation. Not another performance strategy, but a clearer relationship with themselves. And perhaps this brings us to the most important part of the conversation. The distance between who we are and who we could become is rarely created by a lack of intelligence. More often, it is maintained through avoidance. Avoidance of grief, avoidance of vulnerability, avoidance of uncertainty, avoidance of emotional truth, avoidance of confronting the parts of life that no longer feel authentic. Real transformation often begins when someone becomes willing to ask difficult questions honestly. Where have I abandoned myself? What parts of my identity are adaptation rather than truth? What have I normalized that no longer feels psychologically sustainable? What would my life look like if it were organized around congruence rather than performance? These questions can feel unsettling because they challenge identity structures that may have existed for years. But they also create the possibility of genuine change because awareness restores agency. And perhaps this is why Viola Davis's quote remains so powerful. It reframes success entirely. The goal is not perfection, nor is it endless optimization. The deeper task is becoming more fully oneself, more conscious, more integrated, more emotionally honest, more aligned internally. To arrive at the end of life and recognize that, however imperfectly, you moved towards yourself rather than continually away from yourself. That you become more authentic rather than more performative, more psychologically coherent rather than fragmented by external expectation. In many ways, this may be one of the defining psychological challenges of modern life. Not simply how to succeed, but how to remain connected to yourself while doing so. And perhaps that is one of the most important psychological questions any of us can ask.